welcome back to Combat Mission, where we're going to take a look at the different titles, what the differences are between them, and why you might want to play each one. So that means we're going to have an overview of Shock Force 2, Black Sea, Cold War, Battle for Normandy, Final Blitzkrieg, Fortress Italy, Red Thunder, and the weird semi-abandoned outlier with the cult following, Combat Mission Afghanistan. There are a few things to bear in mind here before we get stuck into the details though. Firstly, all the games run on the same engine. When the engine is upgraded, all the games get the upgrade, so none of the different titles are technically superior or inferior to the others under the hood. There are obviously differences between the games, but the major differences are in time period and theatre. Shock Force 2 and Battle for Normandy work on the same engine and have the same controls, but they play differently because there are 64 years of military technological development and 3,000 kilometers between them. In other words, the most recent games are not necessarily the best ones, they're all very comparable. So if you're choosing a game to play, pick one that suits your interests. Finally, all the games come with the scenario editor, so you can build your own maps, make your own missions, and generate more content. Beyond the official campaigns and scenarios, there's a lot of user-made stuff out there. So with that out of the way, let's get on to the details, starting off with Shock Force 2. Shock Force 2 is set in a hypothetical NATO invasion of Syria in 2008. The original Shock Force was the first new generation combat mission game and came out in 2007. Shock Force 2 is a much upgraded iteration. The game takes place in Syria, so it uses the arid tile set, and the base game features the US Army, Syrian Army, and unconventional or insurgent forces. The game is complete with all the modules it's going to ever get. The Marines module adds the US Marine Corps as a faction, the British Forces adds the British Army, and the NATO module adds Canadian, German, and Dutch forces. Like all the combat mission games, Shock Force doesn't pull any punches when it gets to technical representation to try and create game balance. Everything is modelled as realistically as Battlefront can get it, so it's a very asymmetrical game. The Syrian army is horrifically outclassed by NATO forces, for whom the challenge is usually not about winning battles, but winning battles with minimal friendly casualties. Hand in hand with this asymmetric element, Shock Force 2 is also the only combat mission game so far to feature unconventional forces that represent insurgent fighters and elements such as IEDs and car bombs. So thematically, Shock Force 2 very much draws on the 2003 invasion of Iraq and subsequent counterinsurgency operations, as well as operations in Afghanistan, with post-release events like the Syrian Civil War and the rise of ISIS also sitting squarely in the mix. Next up, we have Combat Mission Black Sea. This is the second of Battlefront's hypothetical titles that has become a terrible reality. Your mileage may vary playing a game that is capable of accurately depicting current events. Battlefront began work on Black Sea in 2009 and released in 2015, so it was well underway before everything started kicking off in Ukraine in 2014. The scenario for the game is a fictional Russian invasion in 2017, with Ukraine directly supported by NATO. Obviously, it takes place in Ukraine and uses an Eastern European temperate tile set. The base game features the US Army, the Russian Army, and the Ukrainian Army. Work on the game's first module, which would include the US Marines and Russian and Ukrainian airborne forces, has been moved onto the back burner since February 24th, 2022. This is a less asymmetric title than Shock Force. The warfare in Black Sea is much more peer-to-peer or near-peer, but the US Army is very much at the top of the food chain here. There used to be an undercurrent of complaints in the community about US bias and how the Russians were poorly modelled. Recent events seem to indicate otherwise. Thematically, obviously Black Sea is very topical at the moment with high-intensity conventional warfare, and there are user-created texture mods and maps that can represent specific locations and units. Black Sea is also effective at representing lower intensity or even hybrid or unconventional warfare that resembles real or hypothetical operations in the Donbass and Crimea. The most recent combat mission release is Combat Mission Cold War. This is set in, funnily enough, the Cold War. The base game specifically covers the Fulda Gap in West Germany between 1979 and 1982, so obviously we have a temperate Central European terrain set, but uniquely so far amongst the combat mission titles, it is possible to swap this out for the arid tile set. Cold War also features the US National Training Center, which is definitely not green and temperate. The base game features the US Army and Soviet Army, and because of the fairly extensive time period, the dynamic between the two factions changes over time. In 1979, the Soviets had the upper hand. By 1982, the US Army is beginning to be equipped with Abrams and Bradleys, which bring a suite of much more impressive capabilities and really start to tilt things in the Americans' favour. There is a module in the works focusing on the British Army of the Rhine and the Canadians, as well as pushing the clock back a little bit to 1976. Cold War is all about peer-to-peer armoured and mechanised warfare. There are smaller, more infantry-focused scenarios, but the Soviets in particular really shine when they can start throwing their weight around en masse. So if you've read Team Yankee or Red Storm Rising and you want to get stuck into the Cold War gone hot, this is the game for you. These three, Shock Force, Black Sea and Cold War, are all the modern combat mission games. Cold War can arguably sit in its own category as a kind of in-between, but the remaining titles are all focused on World War II. This makes them very different in level of technology and focus. In the modern games, everything sees better, shoots more accurately, communicates faster, and the battlefield is generally hyper-lethal. In the World War II games, there is less firepower to go around, units have more men in them, communication is much more difficult, and fights can rage back and forth in a way that the finality of modern weapons doesn't really allow. They also encompass real historical events and draw on historical data. So in general, the World War II titles feature real battles, real forces, and real data in a way that the modern titles don't quite. The main difference between the four of them is in scope and theatre. The first of the World War II games to come to Steam is Combat Mission Battle for Normandy. This concentrates on Normandy in 1944, starting from the 6th of June. In the base game, the US Army and German Heer, or regular army, fight it out. There are quite a few modules. The Commonwealth Forces adds in the British Army, Canadians, Poles and Waffen-SS. Market Garden expands these and adds in the Kriegsmarine, Fallschirmjäger, Luftwaffe and terrain elements specific to Holland, including some really big famous bridges, as well as expanding the time period out to September 44. There's also a vehicle pack, which includes some fancier stuff like flamethrowers, obscure vehicles and funnies, and a battle pack focused on scenarios. A second battle pack focused on Utah Beach is in production. The terrain here is really interesting, covering northern France and the Low Countries. There's a mix, but the bocage of Normandy in particular really changes up dynamics of combat and messes with force to space ratios. Bocage busting can actually be a really good way to learn how to play the game because it helps you visualize what you want to do. The battlefield comes pre-delineated and compartmentalized and naturally leads itself to find, fix, flank and finish basics. Battle for Normandy was the second generation combat mission game, originally coming out in 2009. It's changed a fair bit since then, but it has tons of user-made content and remains popular in the multiplayer scene, not least because it plays really well at pretty much any scale. So again with the themes, this is Saving Private Ryan, Band of Brothers and Longest Day Territory. D-Day itself and the Battle for Normandy are generally very, very popular subjects in the military history and wargaming worlds. Other events covered in-game, like the Cobra Breakout, the Great Swan and Operation Market Garden, are also key staples. Following on from Battle for Normandy, we have Final Blitzkrieg. This takes up the action on the Western Front where Battle for Normandy broke off, with the base game running from October 44 to January 45. The big set piece here is of course the Battle of the Bulge. There are a lot of historical actions and accurately modelled chunks of terrain in the Ardennes, but this period also includes the Battle of Aachen and the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest. The base game features the US Army and the German Heer, Waffen-SS and Luftwaffe, including Fallschirmjäger. There is a module in development that will add in Commonwealth forces and expand the time period to the end of the war. Final Blitzkrieg is the late war Western Front game. There are a few new units on both sides compared to Normandy, for example the M36 Jackson for the US, but the main draw is the setting. If you're interested in the Battle of the Bulge and operations at the tail end of 1944, the base game has you covered. The upcoming module should hit up the Rhine crossing and the Allied advance into Germany up until May 1945. The next title we're going to cover is Combat Mission Fortress Italy. This is the most expansive World War II game so far. The base game kicks off with the US Army, German and Italian units fighting in Sicily in summer 43. The Gustav Line module adds in British, Canadian, Polish and New Zealand formations, as well as German Fallschirmjäger, and covers the invasion of Italy up to the fall of Rome on the 4th of June 1944. The second module, Rome to Victory, expands out to cover the rest of the war in Italy, bringing in Indian, Brazilian, South African and Free French forces for the Allies and Waffen-SS and more Luftwaffe units, as well as northern Italian terrain. Fortress Italy is really interesting because it covers such a wide time span and because the terrain is really different to any of the other games. 1943 is the earliest the second generation combat mission games have gone, and some iconic weapons and vehicles are either only just coming into service or are completely absent. Fortress Italy is also the only game which features really mountainous terrain as well, including a map of Monte Cassino in several different states of damage, and this offers a very different challenge to the more open terrain like on the Eastern Front. Speaking of which, the last game in the mainstream, we have combat mission Red Thunder. This kicks off on the Eastern Front in summer 1944, focusing on Operation Bagration and fighting between the German Heer and Red Army. The Fire and Rubble module extends the title from September 44 to the end of the war, culminating in the Battle of Berlin, and filling out the rest of the German factions with the Waffen-SS, Luftwaffe, Kriegsmarine and Volkssturm, while adding partisan forces to the Soviets. There's also a battle pack focusing on battles in eastern Poland in summer 1944. The Soviets in particular play completely differently to any of the other factions, emphasising a mass-based approach and featuring some unique formations such as submachine gun toting tank rider companies. The terrain here is expansive too, ranging from the open plains and huge forests of Eastern Europe to a massive two-part map of Berlin for the endgame. So if the late Eastern Front is what you're interested in, Red Thunder is the combat mission game for you. It's peer-to-peer warfare like the other World War II titles, but a very different, more asymmetric flavour of peer-to-peer. Then finally we have the weird one. Combat Mission Afghanistan was a joint venture between Battlefront and a Russian company focusing on the Soviet-Afghan War. It's somewhat in limbo. The Russian company with the rights has disappeared, so it's remained pretty much in its release state and hasn't seen any of the upgrades and updates that the other games have. I can't see it ever coming to Steam or anything like that. As such, it's a kind of time capsule on the technical side. If you want to see what Combat Mission Shock Force was like when it was released, this is very similar. And obviously the setting stands out as well. If the Soviet experience in Afghanistan is something you're interested in, or you really like asymmetric warfare in big mountainous terrain, this is the combat mission game that deals with that. I don't own it, so I can't really comment on it, though it has a pretty strong following over on the Combat Mission Discord. The TLDR for all this is, if you're interested in combat mission and you don't know which game to pick, choose one that interests you. You're the one who's going to be playing it. There aren't any significant technical differences between them. Pick a title that has a setting or theme that you're going to get the most enjoyment out of. At the time of recording, Shock Force 2, Black Sea, Cold War and Battle for Normandy are easily accessible on Steam, with the remaining World War II catalogue set to follow suit. So hope this quick rundown has helped anybody out there who's struggling to make their mind up or wants to know what options are on the table. I'll catch you in the next video.